creative ways that you guys engaged our young people. And I was hoping you could just talk about back then, because some of the issues you talked about, rising gas prices at the time, the war in Iraq, privatization of Social Security. You brought attention on this House floor of these issues to the next generation. And maybe you could just talk about how you did that and then how we can do that today.
Absolutely. I thank the gentleman from California for yielding and say to my friend from Ohio, it is good to get the band back together.
I'm telling you.
It's really incredible that it's been 10 years. I don't really want to think about the birthday that I just had and where that puts me. I guess a few years after we started the 30-something working group, at least I and our former colleague Kendrick Meek from Florida passed the status of being 30-something, and we were 30-somethings in spirit while we were doing that for a little while. I am a little longer past being a 30-something now, but it is absolutely critical that we have an opportunity now to pass the torch, Mr. Ryan, to the next generation of 30-somethings who are focused on making sure that as we go from generation to generation, as Democrats, we are focused on making sure that those cornerstones of a middle-class life that we talked about 10 years ago, making sure that you don't have to choose between buying your groceries or filling your gas tank so you can get to work, which then, if you can't, would cause you not to be able to afford your groceries. Now, 10 years later, Mr. Swalwell, I had young children back then. Mr. Ryan was single, and now he has young children.
Didn't have any children back
then. So there's hope.
Yeah, you'll be all right.
But my twins are actually 2 years from going to college. And so the student debt crisis that has been looming and has existed and has overly burdened so many Americans is now something that my family has trepidation about. And so it is incredibly timely that we relaunch this working group and make sure that the issues that are important to that next generation get the attention and the focus on the floor of the United States House of Representatives.
And you know, we talk a lot about the next generation, and Congressman Ryan and I were talking about how this affects millennials. But I found, and I invite my colleague from New York, Mr. Jeffries, to take the other podium. But I have found
pick up an instrument. And
pick up an instrument.
Absolutely.
and I don't know if you've heard this in your district, but this issue of college access and affordability, it's actually a family matter. And we just got a tweet from at SKAU61, and she said she wants to get a BA in accounting, and at 53 can't afford to do it. And so we're hearing that it's multi-generational, this access to having higher
Would the gentleman
skills.
yield?
Yes.
In response to your question, whether I've heard this in my district, absolutely. The average debt that an individual carries in student loan debt is about $29,000. I mean, that is crushing debt that for years to be burdened with. I mean, even President Obama, not long prior to becoming president, he and the First Lady have both talked about how they only just had paid off their student loan debt just before they took office. I mean, imagine into your not even late 40s, still paying off your debt from college and postgraduate school. It's just outrageous. Yet Republicans, and let's make sure that we zero in on brass tacks here. Republicans have consistently denied Americans the opportunity to reform the student loan program so that we can ensure that when they are paid a salary, that it is in line with how much they have to actually pay back out of their monthly paycheck to actually make sure that they can make ends meet.
And would the gentlelady yield? I don't know if either Mr. Ryan or Mr. Jeffries has heard of constituent casework like this, but we have constituents in our district who are having their Social Security checks garnished because of student loan debt. And so if Mr. Ryan, or I would yield to Mr. Ryan or Mr. Jeffries, if you heard about this multi-generational challenge.
I feel like we're here to provide a little historical context. So when we back in the day, and that was 2003, 4, 5, 6, before the Democrats took over the House a few years back, we had a student loan system that the banks would do the loans, and the rates were 7, 8, 9%.
Exactly.
And then the federal government would back the loan if someone defaulted. So I loan you $100, and if you default, the gentleman from California will pay me. What a great business to be in.
Yeah.
I mean, no lose, right? So they were covered regardless, and we came in and made some serious reforms to limit the amount of monthly payments and for how many years if you're in the public service. So we made some reforms that I think were really, really important. But as the gentlelady from Florida said, that's the difference. We're aggressively trying to pursue ways of fixing the problem, and if we do a piece, we come back and then we try to get to the next piece. And in the last few years, since 2010, we've keep running into a brick wall where we're not getting the kind of cooperation. But these are the kind of things that the government is supposed to do. And I think we're pretty clear about that. And that's why it is important, as Debbie said, for you to keep coming out here night in and night out, because every night somebody's listening to you. Some nights more than others. Some nights we weren't sure if anyone was listening. But somebody's listening. And you got to just keep pounding and pounding and pounding that message, because this is what's best for the economy, for families, and everyone else that really is going to make a difference. So it's good you're out here pounding away.
Well, I thank the distinguished gentleman first from California for his leadership and for all that you've done to make sure that issues of importance to the next generation of Americans, such as the one that we're discussing here today, get prominence on the House floor, this great vehicle for communicating to the American people. And, of course, to be here with the still young pioneers of this wonderful effort, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz and Congressman Ryan, it's just a great honor. Clearly, we have a student loan debt crisis that commands the attention of the American people and should command the attention of people here in the House of Representatives and on the other side of the Capitol, but does not always do so, which is why communicating the urgency of the situation is so significant. Just the notion, I've got constituents just shocked by the fact that collectively we've got over $1 trillion of student loan debt here in America. And that's a very real number in terms of its implications, as you pointed out, Congressman Swalwell, for the capacity of younger Americans to robustly pursue the American dream. Because when you're saddled with that level of debt burden, it makes it far more difficult to start a family, far more difficult to purchase a home, far more difficult to be part of the next generation of great American entrepreneurs and innovators, because you're less likely to take a risk if you've got this monthly student loan bill that you're unsure as to how you would pay if you were to take some time off to start a business, to invent the next Google or Facebook or Twitter. And so this is really an issue of great significance to us as Americans. And it's a shame, I'd make this last observation. I sat on the Budget Committee for the previous 2 years in the 113th Congress, and the same is the case this year, that Republicans continue to put forth a budget that is not designed to alleviate the problem of higher education affordability. It's designed to make the problem worse. And it would cut over $220 billion over a 10-year period in federal government assistance in a variety of ways to younger Americans who are struggling to get a college education and pursue the American dream. And that's something that we've got to be able to address moving forward, or move in a different direction in terms of who the American people send to this Congress to do their business.
And, you know, I'm wondering, especially for our pioneers here tonight, if it would surprise you to hear that in 2004, right before you started this effort, student loan debt, since 2004, when you started this effort, student loan debt has increased from $346 million collectively for the country to the $1.2 trillion that it is today. That's an increase of 235%. What has happened, or what hasn't happened?
Well, what hasn't happened is a focus in a bipartisan way on making sure that we make college affordability a top priority. And I'll tell you, I know my husband and I are at the intersection in our family of wanting to make sure that as we send our twins, 2 at once, off to college in 2 years from now, that we be able to, one, be able to supplement as much as possible and their college education, so that knowing what we know about their the potential for them to have that debt burden when they graduate, that we can relieve that possibility, and trying to figure out how the heck we're going to add that double whammy expense when they start college, and at the same time being pretty panicked about how much debt they will have to go in themselves if we can't really make sure. And families all across, it's less about me and more about the sort of average middle-class family that is trying to make sure that they can make ends meet for their whole family and make sure that they can send their kids off to start their lives, which is why President Obama and congressional Democrats have proposed that the first 2 years of college be free. Because, and I'll tell you, I have a lot of folks at home in South Florida who have said to me, if I only had to worry about my kids' junior and senior year and how we were going to pay for that, and we knew that at least they could get an AA degree. I mean, over 100 years ago, when we established free universal access to public education in elementary grades and eventually secondary grades, no one would question that. That was considered controversial back then. No one today would consider universal free public education, except maybe some of our friends on the other side of the aisle. Actually, I take that back. But you wouldn't question, you wouldn't think that universal access to public education should be free. We are at the point now in the 21st century where there shouldn't be any question that the first 2 years of college should be free, and we need our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us in that effort.
And part of this is not just first 2 years of college free, but Democrats are also pushing initiatives like how do you streamline and get high school kids into college, community college classes early while they're still in high school to start taking and reducing some of those costs. We have programs in Canton at Stark State where you can get 13 credit hours towards a welding certificate. 13 of 30 hours can be done before you even graduate from high school. So that reduces, and it's free because it's part of your high school public education. So now you're already starting. So it's not just about reducing student loans and reducing debt and Pell Grants and streamlining in first 2 years, but we also, I think, have an obligation to streamline the current system that's K to 12 or K to 14 and make sure we narrow that down. So I've got to step out. But I just want to say thank you, and you got another Irish guy here to carry the flag.
Another Floridian too.
Another Floridian, and I do want to say, just keep pounding away. This is a great way to communicate. You guys are doing it. We got to get more and more from your classes to be up here. So keep up the great work, and I'm out.
I'm glad this reunion happened, and you inspire us to continue going forward. I want to ask the gentleman from New York. I've been to Manhattan. It reminds me a lot, Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, Harlem, reminds me a lot of what we see in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco, just the young entrepreneurial minds. But when we go to these startup spaces or these incubator hubs, I constantly hear how much student loan debt affects their ability to invest in themselves and their businesses. And we're finding that our generation is the least entrepreneurial generation America's ever known at our time. I'm wondering if you've heard stories about that and how it's limiting investments.
Well, that's absolutely correct, and I think what we have to do is really work on changing the equation to facilitate the great minds that we've got in this current generation of younger Americans to be able to go out and be innovators and entrepreneurial in the context of a vastly changing economy, as well as a changing dynamic in terms of the affordability of college education. I'm troubled by the fact, one, if you look at the productivity of the American worker, what we've seen, of course, since the early 1970s is that it's increased dramatically in excess of 275% in terms of American worker productivity. At the same time, wages during that period from the early 1970s to the present have remained largely stagnant, less than 10%. So the equation for the American worker has changed. So what we have is that we've got younger Americans entering into a workforce where the fundamental equation in terms of their compensation has changed dramatically for the worse. The cost of a college education has increased. The amount of financial assistance relative to the cost of that college education has remained stagnant, if not declined in real dollars. And the expectation in terms of the student debt loan burden, one is expected to shoulder upon graduation, has exploded exponentially. You add all of those things together, and it's no surprise that you're going to find yourself in a situation where people don't have the same capability of being entrepreneurial as prior generations. FDR, of course, brought forth the New Deal. What we need for this current generation of Americans is just a fairer deal in the context of giving them the same opportunities to robustly pursue the American dream, start great companies, innovate as prior generations, so we can continue to be great. I'd also note that downtown Brooklyn, interestingly enough, which I represent in the wonderful 8th Congressional District.
Is that where Silicon Alley is?
That's part of Silicon Alley, and it also has more, so glad that you're familiar with our East Coast lingo, but it also has more college students in downtown Brooklyn than Boston and Cambridge combined. And so there's been a great number of young people who have come to Brooklyn, who are contributing to our fantastic innovation culture, but who are struggling with the fundamentals of today's economy and higher education structure that is working against them. And that's why we're here on the floor of the House of Representatives fighting to change that.
Yeah, and here on the floor, any Californian would be nervous when he or she's outnumbered by Floridians, and we're joined by the gentleman from Florida who represents West Palm Beach, Jupiter, Martin County area. And what are you hearing in your district about student loan debt?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the gentleman from California for putting this together and really your leadership. You know, you've been at this for years now, talking to other members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, reminding them about what a critical issue this is. And whether I'm talking to constituents in my district throughout the state of Florida, people, you know, here in the House, we have got to do more to help more people get access to quality and affordable education at all levels, but certainly higher education. And when you look at what I would argue is one of the biggest problems in our country right now, that's the disappearing middle class and this growing divide we have in our country. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, as economies continue to evolve and progress, education becomes more and more of a critical component of that. Yet you look at the policies and you look at really what's holding so many people back, just listening to the gentleman from New York here talking about that lack of opportunity and the debt that is holding so many people back from taking that risk to go ahead and become that entrepreneur, to be that innovative, you know, spirit that made America so great, because they might have $100,000 of debt, they might have a family, they might have some kids, and they're so concerned about this debt, they don't want to take that risk. And that's not what America is about. You know, America is about taking that risk with having the education to do it and then turning it into something great. And understanding that not every, you know, risk is going to always pay off, but you've got to have that background, that education to get you there. And if you're, you know, saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt and overly complex methods to repay them, not being able to refinance, et cetera, then you got a problem. And we're
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield to the gentlelady from Florida.
Because I want to engage as we used to do. I know that you do this as well. But just to follow up on what you just said, because the gentleman from California posed the question and stated the fact that millennials today really aren't starting new businesses. They're not, you know, you would think, and we envision them to be the startup generation. They're living in a startup era, but yet they can't see it. And you know, to use the vernacular of the gentleman from Florida, Congressman Meek, when we were throwing things around on the House floor 10 years ago, let's put the cookie on the bottom shelf here. I mean, if, as you just said, they are saddled with the burden of significant debt coming out of college, and they have when they get a degree, it is very difficult for them to see a pathway to develop that small business, to envision being a pioneer of the next great industry. And so we are literally saddling them with a heavy burden as they leave what is supposed to be the jumping off point for the next phase of their lives. And we're supposed to be passing them the baton so that they can move America forward. It's just not fair, it's not right, and our friends on the other side of the aisle are part of the problem.
And you know, millennials are very collaborative. They're very, I would believe, a problem-solving generation. And what is so frustrating when we talk to them at college campuses or at their work sites is they ask, well, what are you doing about it? And I believe my colleagues here would be happy, thrilled to work with our colleagues across the aisle on solutions on this. But I'm just curious, do you know how many bills we voted on to address student loan debt this Congress? Zero. Zero bills. And at the end of the day, it's not just the least entrepreneurial. We are the least homeowning. We are the least, we're more likely to delay our starting a family by about 5 years. So everything that the generation before us had, we are delaying. Buying a home, starting a family, starting a business. And as the gentleman from New York pointed out, it's affecting the economy.
I'm sorry. If I'm also going to have to go in a moment, but and forgive me if the gentleman would yield, because I wanted to share my own personal story very briefly. I started out, I happened to get married fairly young at 24 years old, but the progress that I was able to make, graduating from a public university, the University of Florida, without debt, the progress I was able to make at the beginning of my adult life, at the beginning of my professional life, enabled me to have a much longer ramp and see many more possibilities because I didn't have that. But my husband and I were able to buy our first house right after we got married, and we've been able to make sure that we can make choices that will maximize our opportunities to ensure that our children, when we had them and now are raising them, have opportunities. And it's so sad that the millennial generation really doesn't see it, doesn't believe it. And that's because there is obstacle after obstacle being thrown in their way right from the start of their most formative years.
On an issue you would never imagine to be partisan.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, thank the gentlelady from Florida for joining us. I hope to see her back.
Carry
Thank
on.
you for pioneering this. The gentleman from New York, I don't know if you heard, but in 2012, the New York Fed reported that for the first time in a decade, 30-year